Radio phone-ins have a strange kind of power that polished panel debates rarely manage to replicate. There's no PR team softening the edges, no careful media training smoothing out the delivery. Just a person, a phone line, and whatever they've been thinking about in the car on the way to work. And every so often, one of those calls lands so cleanly that it ends up reshaping the entire conversation happening around it.
Are you happy to see them back? And let's face it, they'd be great. We'd all want to see the brothers get on, let's be honest. But there is that family reconciliation as well. And is it right that the king effectively learnt it almost as quickly as the rest of the world? Obviously he'll be pleased. He'll get to see his grandchildren, which is a good thing. I don't think Meghan's father has seen the grandchildren to date, has he? We better check that.
I'm really happy to hear that Meghan and Harry are returning to the UK. I think they're a very unproblematic couple. They mind their business, and I do feel like they've done a lot of charitable work. They've worked with veterans. They focus on the victors' gains, and they also advocate for mental health. And I think they do great work. They bond so well together. I think they're inseparable, and I don't understand why they get so much hate, if I'm honest.
Okay,
undoubtedly the family,
the Invictus Games are fantastic, and credit to him. But you've got to remember, he wrote that book Spare, which was pretty condemning of his family. They did the interview on CBS with Oprah Winfrey, in which they made allegations which have subsequently been denied, although who knows if they're true, about people asking the colour of their child. Do you not think, and then of course there's also Prince Harry has talked about a fight with his brother that led to a dog bowl being broken. Do you not think that's causing a few waves?
Do you know what? I can understand, and I'm not going to be biased. Sometimes things are better kept in the family.
Yep.
But the truth also needs to be told. And at the end of the day, we don't know if it's all 100% true. But if somebody has their side of the story to say, there's always two sides of the story. So, sometimes family situations should be, rectified and sorted and move on. But maybe this is their chance to do that, But he went and he focused on his family, and that's what I'm happy he did. And he's moving forward with them to come back to the UK, and I think it's the right thing to do so.
Lastly, if his mother was still alive, late Princess Diana, how would she be reacting to the news that at least her two boys were going to be in the same country again?
Oh, I think she'd be absolutely delighted, definitely. Everyone wants their children to come together when they have a little fight, and personally, I've been through it myself as well, so I know the feeling, but I wish she was here. I think a lot of people do wish that she was here, but I think it's going to be a great outcome for them both to come together.
If I were to say this has come completely and utterly out of the blue, would I be right?
Well, Ben, all I can say to you is that the true People's Princess is finally coming home. This has been the most unexpected development that I've heard all year. And believe you me, there have been an awful lot of unexpected developments when it comes to the Sussexes.
Royal family proper, or the main tier, top tier royal family, get a bit of a break from media scrutiny or media attacks. And as a reward or as a consequence or as a price for that, they do not protect Meghan Markle from media intrusion and media attention with anything like the alacrity or the enthusiasm that they would have protected her sister-in-law. And the examples, I've given you one about the pregnancy bump. It moved on to the columnists the next day. The news stories moved on to the columnists. So when the columnists got hold of the Kate Middleton story, you get bumping along nicely. The Duchess was seen placing a protective hand on her tummy as she exited the event. Whereas when the columnists got hold of Meghan Markle, personally, I find the cradling a bit like those signs in the back of cars. Baby on board, virtue signalling, as though the rest of us Baron Harridans deserve to burn alive in our cars. How do you go from a woman cradling her pregnancy bump to people burning alive in their cars unless you are objectively mad? You have been driven mad by something. You've been driven mad by Meghan Markle. But that is the country to which this couple are returning. And if I knew them, I would wonder why. Well, I don't need to know them to wonder why, but if I did know them, I would probably caution them not to be honest.
Do you welcome them back?
Yeah, I do. I wish them well. Just on a human level, you have to, don't you?
Well, I agree with you, but not everybody does.
Lorraine is in Stratford. Lorraine, what do you reckon?
Thank you for taking my call. I feel really strongly about this.
I'm Caribbean.
Yes.
I'm born and bred in England. I consider myself English. And watching Harry and his brother grow up, they went through a lot.
They certainly did.
For me, it was a case of understanding why he wanted to leave with his family in the first place, given that there was an initial plan. And I draw it back to the initial plan. When the Queen was alive, they had an initial plan, which was to work more closely on the Commonwealth matters because of understandings that Meghan actually would have brought to the table as well. When they got married, I thought that it was a huge plus for the royal family to actually have someone of
I think we forget that,
different
Lorraine.
heritage, and I think that's totally been forgotten.
Yeah, the reaction was
Why?
largely, we're a decent country, we're a decent people until we get poison poured into our ears.
Correct, and I felt the media did that,
For
and
sure.
I feel that they. What we didn't know at the time was Meghan was going through a lot, and we didn't know why. And then all of a sudden, they wanted to step back. Now, from what I recall and what I remember, that was because she lost a child, which is unimaginable. But then if you bring on the onslaught afterwards of the case of they just wanted to step back. They never said they wanted to leave. And if you look at the Queen Mother's, if you look at the Queen's speech, she said it was for a year, and then it would be reviewed. And that's been totally forgotten, overridden by the media. So I felt like the public opinion was strongly against them because they wanted to step back. But that was for mental health reasons.
I think
And
that's
let's-
chicken and egg. I think that the vitriol was in place long before that happened. I mean, some of the stuff I'm reading, 2018, 2019, when Kate tenderly cradles her baby bump, why can't Meghan Markle keep her hands off her bump? Can you
I agree.
explain that? I mean, what
I
on earth
agree.
is going on there? How did we not notice more at the time?
I agree all of that. And as a black woman in this country, I saw that, and many people did see that, although there were still many people that felt the opposite, and I accept that. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But I do think the gravy train went and everybody jumped on the bandwagon and actually forgot what she was going through, what they were going through as a family in the beginning.
Do you think we'll ever be able to get a proper answer to the question of what caused the avalanche of unpleasantness?
No, because I don't think, personally, that what Harry calls the institution and what different people in the royal households will be honest about it. I honestly don't think we'll get to the truth because of that lack of honesty. For whatever reason, it might be because they don't want to, it might be that they can't. I don't think we'll get to the truth. I do think Harry is a person of integrity and does tell the truth, albeit people won't accept it because they think he's influenced a lot more by Meghan. But again,
But
with
that's
that in itself-
misogynistic, isn't it? Or I don't know if that's the right word, but the idea that a woman, any man who, I don't know, wants to get in touch with his own trauma or his own past or understands vulnerability. This is a man that we have all watched tear off a microphone in front of a television camera and rush towards trouble when an alarm went off at Camp Bastion in Afghanistan. And the idea that some armchair critic will sit there saying, oh, he's under the thumb, he's henpecked. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so widely held and, of course, endorsed by so many corners of our media. It is absolutely pathetic. And it's a way, I think, of using a man to attack a woman, isn't it? It's not really an attack on Harry when they say that he's unduly influenced by his wife. They're saying, look at that uppity woman over there. Look at that uppity woman of colour. How dare she have agency? How dare she be an equal partner in a marriage with one of our princes? Who does she think she is?
Correct. And I agree with every part of that. Bring it back to the current day now. Why would they want to come back?
Why?
Things are different, and I do believe that Harry does want to rebuild things.
And the king is getting on a bit, and he's not been well. I lost my dad in 2012. I'd crossed continents for another day, for another year, for another month with him, and maybe it is as simple as that. We shouldn't ever know the real answer, or we may never know the real answer to that question, but we can, I think, and as you've just done rather nicely, we can think out loud about what would be the best way.
Welcome back to the Royal Truth Desk. Today we're breaking down a recent radio phone-in hosted by James O'Brien, where the topic turned to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's reported return to Britain, reconciliation with King Charles and Prince William, and the media scrutiny that's followed Meghan since before she even joined the family. The conversation ended up going somewhere genuinely unexpected, thanks to one caller in particular. A woman named Lorraine, who delivered what's being widely described as one of the sharpest, most pointed challenges this whole saga has received from an ordinary member of the public in quite a while. Let's set the scene first. Phone-in radio has always occupied a slightly different space than televised royal commentary. There's less performance involved, less incentive to play a character for the cameras, and often a raw, more unfiltered version of what people actually think when they're not trying to go viral. James O'Brien's show has built a reputation over the years for letting these conversations run long, letting callers actually finish their thoughts instead of cutting them off after 15 seconds for time. That format matters here, because it gave Lorraine the space to build an actual argument rather than just deliver a soundbite. The kind of rawness that cuts both ways, sometimes producing rambling takes, but sometimes producing something clearer and more direct than any professional commentator would risk saying on camera. So, what did she actually say? From what's been reported and discussed, Lorraine's core challenge centred on what she described as a persistent double standard in how Meghan has been treated compared to other royal figures, both historically and in the present. This isn't a new argument in isolation. Plenty of commentators have made versions of it before. But what apparently made this particular call land differently was the specificity and the calm, methodical way she built her case, rather than simply asserting it as an obvious truth. Let's dig into the double standard argument itself, because it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as pure partisanship, and it deserves real engagement rather than reflexive agreement or dismissal from either direction. The general shape of the argument goes something like this. Behaviours, choices, and even minor missteps that get treated as forgivable, relatable, or simply unremarkable when other royal figures do, them have historically generated outsized criticism when Meghan does anything comparable. Supporters of this argument point to specific side-by-side comparisons that have circulated for years. Critics counter that context, timing, and the specific nature of each situation matter enormously, and that surface-level comparisons often flatten genuinely different circumstances into an unfair equivalence. Both positions carry some legitimate weight, and an honest treatment of the topic probably lands somewhere in the more complicated middle, rather than in either extreme. A less satisfying conclusion than either side usually wants, but probably the more accurate one. What's interesting about Lorraine's framing, based on how it's being discussed, is that she reportedly didn't limit the argument purely to Meghan's race, which is how this conversation often gets flattened in shorthand online discourse, nor did she rest it on any single incident or comparison. Instead, she apparently built a broader case around the cumulative pattern observed over several years, touching on how quickly negative narratives about Meghan got established early on, and how persistently those narratives got repeated regardless of context, clarification or correction. That's a more nuanced, more sophisticated version of the double standard argument than the one that usually dominates comment sections, and it's part of why this particular call reportedly generated so much discussion afterward. It's worth remembering, too, that this kind of pattern-based argument is generally harder to dismiss than a single incident comparison, precisely because it doesn't rely on any one example being perfectly analogous. Critics of the double standard argument often attack it by finding small differences between any two specific incidents being compared. Different context, different timing, different specific wording. But when the argument rests instead on a broader years-long pattern, that kind of nitpicking becomes much less effective, because the claim isn't these two exact things are identical. It's this consistent pattern of differential treatment persisted across dozens of separate incidents over several years. That's a genuinely harder claim to dismiss with a single counterexample. Now, let's talk about the Commonwealth angle, because this is a genuinely under-discussed piece of the broader Sussex story that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Before stepping back from royal duties, Harry and Meghan held roles specifically connected to Commonwealth youth engagement, and there's a real ongoing conversation about what happens to that kind of soft diplomatic work when the people doing it step away from official duties. Some of Lorraine's reported comments apparently touched on this. The idea that whatever personal or family drama surrounds the Sussexes, there was genuine substantive work happening in that Commonwealth space that arguably got lost in the noise of everything else. That's a fair point worth sitting with, separate from any of the more personal or tabloid-driven aspects of this story. That work matters more than it's usually given credit for, too. Commonwealth youth engagement isn't a glamorous headline generator. It's the kind of quiet, relationship-building diplomacy that rarely photographs well and almost never trends, but that arguably does more long-term good than any single high-profile appearance ever could. Harry, in particular, had built a genuine rapport with young leaders across several Commonwealth nations during his time in that role, and there's a reasonable argument that this specific loss, not the loss of titles or duties broadly, but the loss of this particular relationship-building work, represents one of the more concrete, measurable costs of the entire rift, separate from anything to do with family drama or tabloid coverage. Let's get into the stepping back narrative too, because this phrase has quietly done an enormous amount of work in shaping how this entire saga gets discussed for years, and it deserves genuine interrogation rather than being accepted as neutral description. The framing of Harry and Meghan's departure as stepping back, rather than, say, being pushed out or leaving due to specific grievances or any of the alternative framings that have circulated, carries its own implicit judgment. It suggests a kind of voluntary retreat, almost a resignation from duty, rather than a response to specific circumstances that Harry and Meghan themselves have described in considerable detail through interviews, a documentary, and a memoir. Callers like Lorraine apparently push back on this framing specifically, arguing that continuing to use stepping back as shorthand years later obscures rather than clarifies what actually happened. This is where the conversation turned toward the British press more broadly, and here's where things get genuinely uncomfortable for anyone trying to have a balanced conversation about this topic. Uncomfortable in a productive, necessary way, rather than a merely provocative one. Harry's relationship with British tabloid media has been adversarial for years, well documented through legal proceedings and public statements on both sides. The reported caller commentary apparently touched on whether the press has actually reckoned with its own role in this saga at all, or whether it simply moved on to covering the next chapter of the story without any real self-examination of the coverage that came before. That's a genuinely fair question, and it's one that rarely gets asked with this level of directness in mainstream broadcast conversations, which is likely part of why this particular call cut through the way it apparently did. Let's bring King Charles and William into this properly, because the phone-in reportedly touched on both, even if Lorraine's specific challenge centred mostly on the media treatment question. Charles's position remains what it's been throughout this entire saga. A father managing a genuinely difficult balance between personal relationships and institutional responsibility, largely staying above the daily fray while decisions get made carefully and quietly rather than through public statements. William's position remains the more emotionally fraught piece of the puzzle, given the specific publicly aired grievances that have shaped the brothers' relationship over recent years. And as the future king, every choice he makes around Harry inevitably gets read not just as a personal decision, but as a signal about how the monarchy itself will eventually handle family tension once he's the one setting the tone. Neither of their positions gets resolved by a single radio call, obviously, but the fact that ordinary listeners are engaging with this level of detail about the family dynamics suggests the public conversation has genuinely matured beyond simple who's right and who's wrong framing. So here's the actual question at the centre of all this. Is the British media actually ready for Harry and Meghan's return, assuming it happens in some meaningful way? Or will the exact same patterns of coverage that arguably contributed to their departure in the first place simply resume the moment they're back within reach? This is genuinely the crux of what Lorraine's call seemed to be getting at, and it's a fair challenge to put to any outlet currently covering this story, including, frankly, channels like this one. The honest answer is probably complicated. Media organisations rarely undergo dramatic self-reflection just because public sentiment shifts somewhat, especially when the old patterns of coverage historically generated significant engagement and revenue. At the same time, there does seem to be a genuinely growing segment of both media commentators and ordinary members of the public who are more willing to call out the old patterns when they resurface, which creates at least some accountability pressure that didn't exist as strongly a few years ago. Whether that pressure is enough to meaningfully change coverage patterns going forward is something we'll only really know once, or if an actual sustained UK presence from Harry and Meghan puts it to the test. It's worth noting, too, that this entire conversation happening on a mainstream radio phone-in, rather than staying confined to social media threads or specialist royal commentary channels, matters in its own right. It suggests these questions about media accountability and double standards have moved beyond niche discussion into something closer to mainstream public conversation, which is, in its own quiet way, a genuinely significant shift regardless of what happens with any actual Sussex return. It's also worth digging a little deeper into what accountability would actually look like in practice here, because the concept gets thrown around a lot without much specificity. It's one thing for individual commentators to acknowledge, in hindsight, that certain coverage went too far. It's another thing entirely for editorial policy at major outlets to actually change, for headline decisions, photo selections and framing choices to be made differently going forward rather than simply regretted after the fact once public sentiment has shifted. Lorraine's challenge, as reported, seemed to be pointing precisely at that gap between individual regret and institutional change, which is a genuinely harder problem to solve than simply getting people to admit past mistakes. There's also something worth saying about the role of ordinary listeners in pushing this conversation forward at all. For years, criticism of royal media coverage came primarily from specialist commentators, media studies academics, or the Sussexes themselves, all of whom could be dismissed, fairly or not, as having some kind of vested interest in the argument. A caller with no obvious stake in the outcome, simply reacting to what she's observed over several years, carries a different kind of credibility. It's harder to write off as agenda-driven when it's coming from someone who gains nothing personally from making the point. That's arguably the most important thing this particular phone-in accomplished. regardless of what happens next with any actual Sussex return. It demonstrated that this conversation about fairness, accountability and consistency in royal coverage isn't confined to people who are already deeply invested in defending or attacking the Sussexes specifically. It's reached a point where ordinary members of the public, with no particular horse in the race, are willing to engage with it seriously and publicly. And that alone suggests the broader public conversation has shifted more than the headlines alone would indicate. We want to hear your take on this one. Do you think Lorraine's challenge about the media double standard holds up, or do you think it oversimplifies a more complicated situation? Do you think British media coverage would genuinely be different if Harry and Meghan return in a sustained way? Or do you expect the same old patterns to resume immediately? And do you think the stepping back framing has shaped public perception of this story in ways that aren't entirely fair to the Sussexes? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. Calls like Lorraine's remind us that some of the sharpest, most useful takes on this story come from ordinary people, not professional commentators, so don't hold back. If this breakdown gave you something genuinely worth thinking about, go ahead and hit that like button. It makes a real difference for this channel. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Royal Truth Desk and turn on notifications, because we'll keep bringing you the conversations that actually move this story forward, not just the same recycled headlines. If you'd like to support the kind of careful, independent commentary we do here, super thanks is always sincerely appreciated. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.